Welcome to Reformed Thinking.
It's great to be here.
So, picture this. It's the winter of AD 56. We've got this battered, heavily persecuted Jewish tent maker sitting in the Greek city of Corinth.
Right.
And he's looking westward, across the Mediterranean, toward a city of about 1 million people. And this isn't just any city. It's an arrogant, utterly invincible empire that is, well, eventually going to execute him.
Yeah, the tension there is just incredible.
Exactly. So he's writing a letter to a small fractured group of house churches that he hasn't even visited yet. And within that letter, he pens these 2 specific sentences.
2 sentences that literally changed the world.
Right. I mean, these 2 sentences ended up dismantling the greatest empire in the ancient world. They sparked the Protestant Reformation, and they serve as the definitive blueprint for how a human being is actually rescued from eternal destruction.
I really think it's difficult to overstate the tectonic weight of Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17.
Yeah.
Because when you look at the broad sweep of human history, you can trace the rise and fall of entire civilizations, massive cultural revolutions, and profound spiritual awakenings directly back to the theological shockwave contained in these specific words. I mean, we are dealing with the absolute beating heart of the Christian faith here.
We really are. So our mission for today is a comprehensive deep dive into the architecture of those 2 sentences. We want to unpack the raw, unfiltered power of this text for you, the listener, and see how it confronts, not just the arrogance of the first century Roman Empire, but also the modern church's heavy reliance on pragmatism.
Right, and cultural relevance, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But to truly feel the impact of what Paul is writing, we can't just look at the theology in a vacuum, right? We have to immerse ourselves in the intimidating shadow of the empire it was sent to.
Yeah, you really have to zoom out and visualize Rome in the mid-1st century.
Set the scene for us.
Well, this was a cosmopolitan beast. I mean, a metropolis of 1 million people is staggering, even by early modern standards. But in the ancient world, it was just this unparalleled concentration of humanity, wealth, and honestly, brutality.
Wow.
Even the very name of the city in Greek home, it literally translates to might or strength.
So it wasn't just a label, it was their entire identity.
Exactly. It was an ethos. Rome measured its entire worth by its military legions, its gladiatorial arenas, and those triumphal processions where conquered kings were literally dragged through the streets in chains.
Just a massive display of dominance.
Right. And it had an incredibly rigid social hierarchy.
And it was also a society that was just choking on its own decadence, wasn't it? I mean, the historian Tacitus, who was a Roman himself, offered this brutally honest assessment of his own capital.
Yeah, he didn't hold back.
No, he really didn't. He described Rome as the place where, let me get the quote, where all things atrocious and shameful from every quarter flow together and are celebrated.
And remember, this is the era of early Nero.
Right, so it's this intoxicating, suffocating atmosphere of imperial pride. And the engine driving all of the daily interactions in this society was a ruthless honor and shame culture.
Yes. That is so crucial to understand.
Your currency wasn't just your gold, It was your public perception, who you knew, the power you could leverage, your status. That was your lifeblood. So to be publicly shamed was essentially social erasure. It was a fate worse than death for a Roman.
And into this hyper-proud, power-obsessed apex of human civilization, Paul basically announces his intention to show up and preach a message centered entirely on a Jewish carpenter.
A carpenter from Galilee, of all places.
Right, from this despised provincial backwater. Yeah. And not only that, but a carpenter who had been executed by the Roman state.
And not just executed, crucified.
Yes, crucified. And I think we have completely sanitized crucifixion today.
Oh, totally. We wear it as gold jewelry.
Right. We emboss it on leather Bible covers.
Yeah, we've lost the absolute revulsion that a first-century Roman would have felt at the mere mention of the word. I mean, the Roman statesman Cicero actually argued that the very word cross should be far removed not only from the bodies of Roman citizens, but from their thoughts, their eyes, and their ears.
Because it was the ultimate degradation, it was engineered specifically to be the most ignominious, torturous, and shameful form of execution imaginable.
It wasn't for the elite.
No, not at all. It was reserved exclusively for the lowest tier of society. Rebellious slaves, insurrectionists, the absolute worst criminals. In fact, a Roman citizen was legally exempt from being crucified, no matter what their crime was.
Wow, so it really was about complete humiliation.
Exactly. The entire point of the cross was to strip a human being of all honor, exposing them naked to absolute public disgrace and mockery before they literally suffocated to death.
So from a purely natural sociological perspective, for Paul to march into the intellectual and military capital of the world and declare that a crucified criminal is the supreme lord of the universe.
It was absolute madness.
Yeah, it was social suicide.
Completely. And that actually brings into focus the intense powder keg dynamics happening inside the Roman house churches themselves.
Right, because Paul is writing to a community that is deeply fractured. There's this massive sociological friction threatening to tear the church apart, and it revolves around this historical event from just a few years prior, right?
Yeah, the Edict of Emperor Claudius.
Let's unpack this for the listener. What exactly happened there?
So in AD 49, Emperor Claudius expelled the entire Jewish population from Rome. And the historian Suetonius records that this was due to constant rioting instigated by a figure he calls Chrestus.
Which most historians agree is just a Roman misunderstanding of disputes within the Jewish community over Christ.
Exactly. So overnight, all Jewish believers in Rome are forcefully deported. They have to just abandon their homes, their businesses, and their house churches.
Which means the Gentile believers are suddenly left all alone to run the church.
Yes. For 5 whole years, this Gentile demographic is entirely in charge.
And you can imagine how the culture of those house churches organically shifted during that time. I mean, they're no longer observing Jewish dietary laws.
Right. They aren't strictly keeping the Sabbath in the traditional Jewish manner anymore.
They are operating completely free from the cultural weight of the Mosaic traditions. But then, in AD 54, Claudius dies. The edict is lifted, and the Jewish Christians flood back into the capital.
And the culture clash was just inevitable. It was explosive.
Yeah, it's like a substitute teacher taking over a classroom for 5 years, completely changing all the rules, throwing out the old seating chart, and then the original teacher returns expecting everything to be exactly the same.
That's a perfect analogy. The returning Jewish believers expected a Jewish cultural dominance. But the Gentile believers had established a new norm, and they felt absolutely no obligation to submit to the yoke of the Mosaic law.
So they're fighting over dietary practices, holy days, and fundamentally who possesses the cultural and theological high ground. It's a sociological time bomb. So how does Paul use this letter to diffuse that?
Well, his broader missionary strategy depended entirely on diffusing it, because his eyes are fixed on Spain.
Right, he wants to go further west.
Yeah. His ambition is to take the gospel to the furthest western reaches of the known world, and Rome is the strategic launching pad. He needs them to be his financial and logistical base of operations.
And a fractured, bickering, inwardly focused church cannot launch a global mission.
No, they would be utterly paralyzed by their own internal politics.
So to forge this unity, Paul doesn't just send a superficial list of behavioral rules to negotiate their dietary disputes, does he?
No, he sends them a towering, majestic theological thesis. And Romans 1.1 and 17 serve as the structural foundation for literally everything that follows.
Let's talk about that structure. In classical rhetoric, this is known as the propositio, right?
Yes, the formal, thematic thesis statement. Everything Paul has written in the first 15 verses is building up to this exact moment. And all 16 chapters that follow flow organically out of it.
Wow.
If you remove these 2 verses, the entire architecture of the epistle just collapses.
Okay, let's trace the cascading logic in the Greek text leading into this thesis. It's fascinating. Paul builds this unbreakable chain using the Greek conjunction gar, which translates to for or because.
Right.
So in verse 15, he declares his eagerness to preach the gospel to those in Rome. Then he drops the first link. He is eager to preach, for he is not ashamed of the gospel.
Yes.
The second link follows immediately.
Yes.
He is not ashamed, for the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. And finally, the third link. It is the power of God, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed.
It is a masterful step-by-step progression. I mean, he moves from his internal, personal apostolic boldness to the external, objective divine power of the message itself, and finally he grounds it all in the underlying eternal theological reality of God's righteousness.
It is literally an unbreakable chain of divine logic.
Exactly.
But here's where it gets really interesting. If this thesis is all about the glorious saving power of the gospel, why does Paul immediately pivot in the very next verse 18-2, the terrifying concept of the wrath of God?
It's a huge shift.
It really is. He launches into this sweeping, dark, multi-chapter indictment of human depravity. Why drop the listener into the abyss of God's wrath right after announcing the good news?
Because the good news is completely unintelligible without the bad news. I mean, the gospel cannot be properly understood, let alone cherished, without a biblical comprehension of the wrath of God.
That makes sense.
Why is the revelation of God's righteousness in the gospel such a desperate necessity for us? Verse 18 answers that. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Paul is meticulously establishing the universal guilt of mankind here.
Right. He spends the next 2 chapters proving that the Gentiles are guilty through their idolatry, and the Jews are equally guilty because they have the law but constantly break it.
The entire world is locked in a prison house of sin.
Which means humanity is completely devoid of any internal merit or moral achievement that could possibly satisfy a perfectly holy creator.
Exactly. Salvation, in Paul's mind, isn't about, moral improvement or finding your life's purpose or tapping into your potential.
No, it is fundamentally a judicial rescue mission.
Yes. A rescue from God's own righteous, imminent condemnation. We often erroneously pit the wrath of God against the grace of God, as if they're like competing moods in the divine mind.
Or like the Old Testament is the wrathful God and the New Testament is the gracious God.
Right. But both wrath and grace arise from the exact same source. His perfect, unyielding holiness. His holiness demands the punishment of sin, and his holiness provides the substitute for it.
And this biblical framework stands in sharp, tragic contrast to modern cultural assumptions. I mean, the sources note this staggering statistic. Over 50% of professing evangelicals today believe that mankind is inherently good.
Over 50%. It's wild.
It really is. And if you hold that premise, if you believe humans are fundamentally decent people who just make occasional mistakes or are victims of their environment, then the gospel entirely loses its miraculous nature.
It absolutely does.
It ceases to be a supernatural rescue from eternal destruction and is reduced to mere good advice. It just becomes this therapeutic life coaching session designed to help you live your best life.
Because your view of the human condition determines the entire trajectory of your theology.
Yeah.
If man is basically good, the gospel is just a religious suggestion competing in a pluralistic marketplace of ideas. But if man is spiritually dead, if he is totally depraved, meaning every faculty of his being is tainted by sin and he's utterly incapable of willing any spiritual good, then the gospel must be a divine unilateral intervention.
And Paul knows that his message, that humanity is totally depraved, completely helpless, and requires the execution of a substitute, is profoundly offensive.
Oh, it was deeply offensive to the Roman mind then, and it's offensive to the modern mind today.
Which brings us to the very first assertion of his thesis in verse 16. Paul writes, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel."
And the Greek verb he uses there is episkinomai.
Okay, what does that imply?
It denotes a very deep, intense personal disgrace or embarrassment in the face of public contempt. Again, in an honor-shame culture, associating with a crucified Messiah invites absolute social ignominy. But Paul employs this brilliant rhetorical device here called litotes.
Right, an intentional understatement.
Exactly.
By stating the negative, "I am not ashamed," he is actually forcefully affirming an overwhelming, uncompromising positive pride in the cross. He isn't merely saying, "I will grit my teeth and tolerate the embarrassment of this message."
No, he's saying, I glory, I triumph, I boast exclusively in the cross of Christ.
The sources we're analyzing today use this unashamed posture to launch some really heavy critiques against the modern religious landscape. And I want to be clear for the listener, we are just impartially reporting on the arguments the source materials are making here, but the critique is fierce.
Very fierce.
The sources argue that we are seeing a widespread phenomenon where modern institutions are, in reality, deeply ashamed of the core tenets of the Christian message. They point to seeker-sensitive church models, pragmatic marketing methodologies, moralistic therapeutic deism, and the prosperity gospel.
Yeah, the sources argue that the underlying strategy of these movements is to make the church attractive and palatable to a secular, skeptical culture. And to achieve that, the offensive edges of the biblical text are systematically sanded down.
Right. Doctrines like eternal hell, divine wrath, the total moral inability of fallen man, and the blood-soaked reality of substitutionary atonement are, according to the text, soft-pedaled or outright denied.
And the authors also point to a concerted push, which they identify in the adoption of modern secular ideologies like critical race theory and various forms of liberal theology to basically redefine the fundamental problem of humanity.
Right. So instead of the problem being humanity's innate sin and rebellion against a holy God, the problem is recast in purely humanistic or sociological terms.
Exactly. And consequently, the sources argue that the solution is no longer the objective supernatural power of the gospel, but rather political activism or social restructuring. They view trading the divine power of the word for pop psychological entertainment or sociological frameworks as evidence of a church that is deeply embarrassed by its own foundational message.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? I mean, imagine holding the only known cure for a terminal global pandemic.
Yeah, okay.
The cure is 100% effective.
Mm-hmm.
But you refuse to administer the medicine because you think the syringe looks too frightening, or you're embarrassed by the font on the packaging. So instead of giving them the cure, you give them a mint and tell them to think positive thoughts.
That's a great way to put it.
The sources argue that trying to rebrand Christianity to make it fit comfortably into a decadent culture is a profound failure of nerve, and it destroys its actual saving power.
And Paul refuses to alter the medicine. He immediately shifts focus from the attitude of the messenger, his refusal to be ashamed, to the actual engine of the message itself. Like, what exactly makes this gospel so potent that he would endure beatings, shipwrecks, and martyrdom to proclaim it?
And he answers that in the second clause of verse 16. For it is the power of God unto salvation.
Right. And the Greek word translated as power there is dynamis, which is the root for our English word dynamite.
Ah, I love that connection.
It's powerful. But we need to look closely at the Greek syntax here. Paul uses dynamis without the definite article. He doesn't just call it the power. By omitting the article, he's emphasizing its qualitative nature.
So he is establishing that the gospel is not merely news about power or a historical description of power. The gospel is inherently divine energy in kinetic operation.
Exactly. It is the active power of God tearing into the fabric of fallen humanity. And the text explicitly grounds this power in God himself. It belongs exclusively to him.
Think of the contrast Paul is drawing for his Roman audience there. I mean, they worshiped the coercive, fragile power of Roman legions, right? Swords, shields.
They revered the rhetorical power of Greek philosophers.
But Paul says the gospel possesses spiritual omnipotence. Furthermore, this power is profoundly Trinitarian in its operation. The Father decrees and purposes the salvation from eternity past. The Son accomplishes it in history through his death and resurrection, and the Holy Spirit sovereignly applies it to the heart of the individual sinner.
This is what theologians refer to as an effectual calling. When the gospel is preached, it is not merely issuing an invitation to a spiritually dead corpse, hoping it decides to resuscitate itself.
No, it is the voice of Christ standing outside the tomb of Lazarus shouting, "Come forth!" The power of the word itself imparts the life necessary to obey the command.
And because this power is entirely divine in origin and execution, it leaves absolutely no room for human contribution. The theological implications here in the sources are massive. This text completely dismantles Arminian synergism.
Right, which is the popular idea that God and man cooperate to achieve salvation.
Yeah, that idea that God casts a vote for you, Satan casts a vote against you, and you cast the deciding vote.
The sources enthusiastically affirm the Reformed rejection of that. And it also destroys Pelagianism, the ancient heresy claiming man has the inherent moral ability to choose God on his own. Natural man has totally lost all ability of will to any spiritual good accompanying salvation.
He cannot save himself, prepare himself for salvation, or cooperate with grace until his heart is supernaturally regenerated.
So if a person is going to be rescued from the righteous wrath of the Almighty, it must be accomplished entirely by an outside power. But what exactly is it saving us from and to?
Well, Paul says it is the power of God unto salvation, and the Greek word soteria encompasses far more than just getting a get-out-of-hell-free card. Biblical salvation is a comprehensive rescue operation that unfolds in 3 distinct phases.
Let's break those down.
First, there is forensic justification. This is freedom from the penalty of sin. It happens instantaneously the moment a sinner believes. You are legally declared righteous.
Okay, penalty is gone. What's the second phase?
Second, progressive sanctification. This is freedom from the power and dominion of sin. Unlike justification, which is a one-time legal declaration, sanctification is an ongoing, lifelong process.
The daily, grueling work of mortifying sin.
Exactly. And finally, ultimate glorification. This is the future freedom from the very presence of sin.
Penalty, power, and presence. The gospel is the power of God to accomplish all of it. And Paul insists this divine rescue mission is universally available, but he introduces a very specific and potentially controversial order of operations.
Yeah.
He writes that it is to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek.
Yeah, that small phrase is a masterclass in pastoral theology designed to completely dismantle the pride of both factions in Rome. Look at the universal unifying condition to everyone who believes.
It completely shatters Jewish legalism and Gentile elitism.
Absolutely. There's only one single condition for participating in this salvation, and that is faith. But we must be incredibly precise about the nature of this faith. Faith is portrayed here as continuous, ongoing trust, but it is not a meritorious work.
If faith is viewed as a work, grace ceases to be grace.
Exactly. The Reformers brilliantly defined faith as the causa apprehendens, the instrumental cause. Think of it as an empty hand. A beggar extending a filthy, trembling, empty hand to receive $1 million gift does not earn the gift by the act of reaching out.
The value is entirely in the gift itself, not the hand that receives it.
Right.
But wait, if everyone is equal at the foot of the cross and both Jew and Gentile are saved by the exact same empty hand of faith, why does Paul explicitly say, to the Jew first? Doesn't that create a hierarchy? Doesn't it feed the very Jewish cultural pride he is trying to dismantle?
It's a vital distinction between soteriological worth and redemptive historical order.
Okay, unpack that.
Paul is absolutely not saying that ethnic Jews have more saving worth or that they have a superior mechanism for salvation. But he is acknowledging the undeniable reality of redemptive history. God entrusted the Jewish people with the covenants, the law, the prophetic promises. The Messiah himself was a Jew.
So the gospel mandate was geographically and chronologically sequential. It went to Jerusalem first.
Exactly. But, and also to the Greek, permanently revokes any ethnic monopoly on grace. When applied to the fractured Roman house churches, this doctrine forges an indissoluble unity. Jewish believers couldn't boast in the law. Gentile believers couldn't boast in their philosophy. Both were saved by identical grace.
Which leads us to the summit of the text. We know the gospel is the power of God, and we know it comes through faith to everyone. But what is the exact mechanism by which this salvation is applied?
This brings us to verse 17. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith.
This single sentence is the hinge of modern church history.
It really is. This is the verse that birthed the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther, sitting in the tower in Wittenberg, was utterly paralyzed by the terror of God's justice, he confessed he actually hated this phrase, the righteousness of God.
Because he was operating under the medieval Catholic understanding that it referred exclusively to God's punitive, retributive justice, the impossibly high standard of divine perfection.
Right, and Luther knew he could never meet that standard. But then, through rigorous exegesis, Luther realized that dikaiosyn theo, the righteousness of God, does not refer to the standard by which God judges us, but the gracious gift of righteousness that God bestows upon us.
It is a purely forensic, legal declaration. It is what the Reformers called aestitia aliena, an alien righteousness.
And that word alien is paramount. It means foreign, outside of ourselves. It is a righteousness wrought entirely by the historical life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is then legally credited to our account. The mechanism for this is known as the double imputation of Christ's obedience.
Let's unpack this double imputation. It involves Christ's active and passive obedience, right?
Yes. Christ's passive obedience refers to his willing submission to suffering and death on the cross. He passively allowed the holy vengeance of God against sin to be poured out upon himself. That is the first imputation. Our sins are legally transferred to Christ, and he pays the penalty for them in full.
Okay, let's unpack this using a financial analogy. Passive obedience is like a billionaire stepping in to pay off your infinite, crushing trillion-dollar debt. Your debt is wiped out, but now you're just at zero. You don't have any actual wealth.
Exactly. Mere innocence is not enough to stand in the presence of God. One requires perfect positive righteousness, and that is where Christ's active obedience is absolutely essential.
What did that look like?
During his 33 years on earth, Jesus lived a life of flawless, perfect submission to the Father. He kept every law to weave a perfect robe of righteousness. And in the second imputation, that perfect record of obedience is legally transferred to the believer.
Going back to our analogy, active obedience is that same billionaire then depositing his infinite wealth into your account. You aren't just debt-free, you are legally declared infinitely wealthy in the eyes of the court.
That is beautiful, yes. Double imputation is the only way God can be both just and the justifier.
And because this doctrine is the central pillar of the Christian faith, it has been relentlessly attacked. The hosts of the sources we are looking at enthusiastically affirm the explicit rejection of three major theological errors here.
Right. First is the Roman Catholic view formulated at the Council of Trent, which teaches infused righteousness.
That grace is poured into a person, enabling them to become intrinsically holy over time to earn justification.
Yes, which the Reformed view vehemently rejects, insisting justification is purely external and legal. The second error is the new perspective on Paul, championed by scholars like N.T. Wright.
Right, which attempts to redefine justification merely as a declaration of covenant or ecclesial membership, completely gutting the penal substitutionary nature of the cross.
And the third is the federal vision movement, which similarly distorts the purely forensic, imputed nature of Christ's active obedience by reintroducing human covenantal faithfulness into the equation.
Against all of these, Romans 1.17 rings out, alien righteousness, received by faith alone. And Paul emphasizes this exclusivity with the phrase, from faith to faith.
Ek pistios eis pistin, it means absolute exclusivity by faith, from start to finish. It utterly excludes human works at every stage of the journey.
Now, Paul knows this radical doctrine of faith alone is going to sound like a dangerous new invention to Jewish ears. So immediately, he anchors it in ancient history.
Yes, in the second half of verse 17, he writes, "As it is written, the just shall live by faith," quoting Habakkuk 2.4.
And the context of Habakkuk is amazing. He's standing on a watchtower facing the terrifying impending judgment of the Chaldean invasion, and God tells him the proud will perish, but the righteous will survive by steadfast trust in God.
And there is a fascinating translation nuance here that the sources point out. In the original Hebrew, it says, by his faithfulness. In the Greek translation, the Septuagint, it says, by my faith, or God's faithfulness.
But when Paul quotes it, he deliberately drops the pronouns completely.
He makes it absolute, by faith. He inextricably links the righteous with by faith, meaning the one who is righteous by faith shall live.
By bringing a 600-year-old prophecy into this, Paul is proving the theological continuity of grace. Abraham, David, Habakkuk, and the first-century Roman Christians are all saved by the exact same mechanism. There is no Old Testament way of works versus a New Testament way of grace. It has always been solidified.
Always.
We have climbed a massive theological mountain today, but the sources insist this text must be pressed upon the conscience of the modern hearer. It demands the annihilation of human pride.
Because Paul wanted a church characterized by confidence, humility, assurance, repentance, and unity. The modern application is identical. The text strips away all excuses, whether you're hiding behind secular moralism, religious rituals, or church attendance.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, how does resting in this alien righteousness actually change how you, the listener, live on a Tuesday morning facing a crisis at work or a failure in your family?
It changes everything because your standing before God doesn't fluctuate based on your daily performance or cultural approval. You are freed from the anxiety of self-reliance. When you fail on a Tuesday morning, the gospel declares your righteousness is seated at the right hand of the Father, and it is perfect.
So you obey out of assured gratitude, not fearful striving.
Exactly.
Let's briefly recap the monumental weight of what we've covered in Romans 1.1 and 17. We've seen unashamed proclamation, divine power, universal scope, alien righteousness imputed by faith alone, all rooted in ancient prophecy.
It is the complete blueprint of our rescue.
It really is. I want to leave you with a final, unmentioned thought to mull over on your own. Consider the ultimate historical irony. Paul sent this letter to Rome, the epicenter of human power, military might, and imperial pride. The Caesars thought their empire would last forever. But where is the Roman Empire today?
It's in ruins, studied in history books.
Meanwhile, the message of the crucified Jewish carpenter, the message Paul is not ashamed of, built a global, enduring community that outlasted the very empire that executed him. What if the true power to change the world doesn't look like political domination or cultural relevance at all, but looks exactly like the structural grace of Romans 1.1617? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep seeking, keep questioning, and rest in the truth.